There's a lot of things that we could talk about specifically about how we think and how human beings come together in groups. One of the things we have to understand, though, is what do we individually bring that's different from somebody else? One way to look at this is what we call the thinking paradox. In the 1700s, there was a mathematician and philosopher named Laplace. Laplace was an interesting guy. He spent a lot of time thinking about thinking. One of the first things he began to look at in some of his studies and in some of his work was this idea of the theory of determinism. The theory of determinism basically says that as a human species, we have developed blocks of knowledge, if you will. And this is unique to us as a species. These are blocks of knowledge that get passed on from generation to generation to generation. And these blocks of knowledge are kind of like axioms, if you will. They're undisputed truths to a certain degree. It's how humans have learned to solve their problems throughout generations. A lot of the problems that I've learned to solve today aren't because it's something that I've necessarily done, but it's something I've read that somebody else learned, or I learned from a professor who learned from a professor. So, for example, we know a lot more today about medicine than we did 1,000 years ago, not because I specifically have something to do with medicine, but somebody else did, and they put that in a book, and they taught that to students and doctors, and from generation to generation, these green blocks of knowledge of how we solve our human problems continue to grow, continue to stack up. That same dynamic happens with us individually. So things I learned from my father, things I learned from a professor, things I learned in my experiences, both good things and tragedies, all of these create these green blocks in our lives. And this is how we solve our problems. So when I see a particular thing that is happening, a context, an issue, I go to the experience base, the education base I have. I go to my green blocks and I try to sort through those green blocks so that I can better understand how to react to that given situation. These green blocks, according to Laplace, can be very, very powerful. In fact, we can even predict the future with our green blocks. For example, I can line up the green blocks that I know about the physics, and I can predict with near certainty where Venus will be in the sky this time next week. These green blocks are things that allow us and empower us to determine how best to react within the world. But Laplace also understood that there's more to the human experience than just determinism. Those axioms are truths. In reality, humans are very, very complex and vexing to a certain point. We have the ability to be fickle. We can change our minds. You can have two different people with the same illness, give the same blue pill to both of them. One lives and one doesn't. You can raise two boys, raise them exactly the same way. One turns out to be a certain type of a personality and the other completely different personality. Human beings are unique, and there's a level of uncertainty. In fact, I would say that in uncertainty, there is a dynamic where humans live. More human activity happens in the theory or the realm of uncertainty than in determinism. Well, what's interesting is that these two often can become conflictual with each other. Laplace had a friend who was a gambler, and he came to Laplace. He said, "Hey, Laplace, you're kind of a numbers guy. Maybe you can help me with a problem I'm having." He was rolling two dice, and apparently he was losing a lot of money. And he said, "Could you maybe help me come up with a scheme that would maybe make me not lose so much money?" Laplace said, "Sure, let me take a look at it." So he got out his pen and paper, and he sat down, and he started in the theory of determinism. What are those things about rolling two dice that we can find out that are absolutely true, that are axioms, if you will? He determined that there's really only one way to roll a two. That's snake eyes, right? Two ones. There's really only one way to roll a three, a two and a one. But as the numbers get bigger, there's more ways, more combinations to roll that number. So for instance, an 8 can be rolled a 4 and a 4, a 6 and a 2, a 5 and a 3. These were truths that he could determine to be undisputable about rolling two dice. On the other hand, though, he also realized there was more to rolling two dice than just what could be determined. You don't really know what numbers are coming up. In the theory of uncertainty, it would say that there's the gamble part of this is that when I roll those two dice, any combination really could come up. But what he did by taking an examination of what he knew to be true, the theory of determinism, and combining that with what he knew was uncertain, infusing those two together, he came up with another theory. And that, of course, is the theory of probability. In fact, Las Vegas should probably build a statue of this guy and put it on Main Street, because without Laplace and the theory of probability, they wouldn't exist today. What he did is he took into account the things he knew to be true. He also took the time to realize the things that he didn't know, the uncertainty, and then he infused those together, and that created the theory of probability. This same dynamic applies to more than just dice and gambling. It applies in human relationships. Often what we have in our lives are our green blocks. How do we solve our problems? How do we raise our kids? How do we have healthy relationships? How do we lead at work? These are the green blocks that have been successful for us. The problem is that my life is not your life. My story is not your story. I was raised in a certain family. I have certain relationships, certain experiences, some good, some bad, and all of those have shaped my green blocks. But the rest of the world has different blocks. Now, we may share some of those green blocks together, and we can have common ways of solving problems, but we also have different blocks. And this is where the theory of uncertainty has to be considered. When I'm leading people, I have to understand and appreciate that the way I solve problems can be successful and work for me, but that doesn't mean it's going to work for everybody. What a successful leader does is they get above the fray of their own personal bias. And this is where bias comes from, is we get so entrenched in our own green blocks that we think this is my way or the highway. This is the only way to do it. And what we lose sight of is that sometimes other people have better green blocks for a particular context based on their background, their experience, their situation. But unless we're the kind of leader that feels comfortable enough to get out of our green blocks and live over in some of this messy world of uncertainty, then we're always going to live on our own thinking, our own bias, if you will. And it takes more than just one person, one person's thought to really develop something that's formidable. If we do this right, if we take into account those things that we know to be true, that we've found to be successful, but we're also humble enough to understand that there are other people that have things that we don't understand, that's uncertain for us, that they have some parts of their life and experience and education, and we combine those two together, then what we will do is we will increase the probability that the relationships we have and the people we lead in the workplaces and our marriages and even our kids will be better than if we didn't do that. Now notice I said we just increase the probability. There's no guarantees. The reason why there's no guarantees is because of this theory of uncertainty. But what I can guarantee you is this. If you take into account the things you know to be true, those green blocks of success that you've had, but then you are also humble enough to take into account the uncertainty of the human phenomenon, you will increase the probability that the decisions you make will be better than if you didn't do that at all and you just lived in your own green blocks.